All right. Looks like we're now live. I'm going to give it a few moments for viewers to pop in. This is the first of the philosophy pop-ups that we're going to be doing in in April. That's right. I was going to say March, and I knew that wasn't right. So let me get everything set up here, get into the live control room so I can actually read people's comments and stuff. We've already got 12 people here, so that's pretty good. People are popping in, showing up. Here we go. Live control room. Okay. Oh, I already have a few comments. I'm going to take this one. Mohammed said, "Hey, missed you just in time. My girlfriend got mad." Well, personal relationships are one of those places where that happens quite often. So hopefully this will be of some use. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about philosophy and what philosophy has to say about anger. And I'm mostly going to talk about ancient philosophy because the schools in antiquity were really quite worried about this phenomenon of anger. And then I'll answer comments, questions, all those sorts of things. People are already asking questions that are probably going to get answered in the presentation that I'm about to give. But we'll pick up some of the other ones as they come in. Before that, I do want to point out I'm trying something new on this. In the cards, I put a poll, which is something I haven't tried in the past. So if you're interested, you can take it. I was just kind of curious about how people view their own dealing with anger, understanding anger, that sort of thing. So it's kind of a fun thing to do. And I also put in the cards, which you can find by clicking on the top right corner, the playlist, the philosophy playlist, Philosophy and Anger, which contains most of my videos where I'm discussing different philosophers and what they have to say about anger. I don't know that I've actually put the new Cicero stuff in there, so I need to get on the stick about that as well. So let me talk about ancient philosophy and anger. And yes, I will in fact start with Plato because that's one of the first, not quite systematic treatments, but certainly discussing it in detail that we can find. I mean, there's a lot of discussions about anger coming up in the Homeric texts, the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's a lot of stuff going on as well in Greek, tragedy, some in comedy as well. And then the lyric poetry is great. But Plato is the first person to look at it philosophically, I'd say. I mean, you might say, well, Heraclitus has that quote about anger is hard to master. Yeah, but Heraclitus is not systematic. We don't possess his book on nature where he might have talked about it a bit more. We just have a few fragments. So, let's talk about Plato. Plato is going to discuss anger in terms of what he calls thumos, and I'll actually write the word down here in the chat on the side for you. And thumos is a Greek term that in some respects means like this part of you, right? And it's the riled up portion of you. Sometimes it's translated as spirit or passion. There really isn't a great way to translate it. But Plato says in the Republic that this is the part of us that gets angry. This is that middle part, when we talk about the Platonic tripartite theory of the soul or personality. You've got reason on the top, the rational part, the appetites down below, and then you got this middle part, thumos, which is the part of us that's concerned with sense of right and wrong and honor and social status and who did what to whom and who deserves what. And it's the part of us that gets angry. And it's also the part of us that is concerned with the virtue of courage or with its counter vice of cowardice. And Plato seems to think that some people are more naturally thumotic than others. That means that they're more driven by that middle range of desires and pleasures and preoccupations. Ideally, reason, the rational part, should be running the show and telling thumos what to do, and then thumos kind of enforces it on the rest of the soul. But quite often, in most people, their soul is out of whack. And so, there's a lot of really interesting discussions in Plato about what it is that gets us angry and how we end up, acting when we're angry. And, I think one of the things that's most interesting as a contribution that Plato makes, and I've talked about this in many other places, is Plato realizes that some of the anger that we feel comes from disagreeing with other people, and not just disagreeing about minor things that could easily be resolved. Like he says, people don't get into, angry shouting matches with each other over mathematics. If you think somebody's got something wrong, show them the proof, right? So what is it that we actually do get worked up about? And Plato talks about this in the Gorgias. He talks about this in the Euthyphro. It's coming up again as well. I don't exactly remember where in the Republic. What we can call moral values, good and bad, just and unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, or the fine and the base, if you like, the noble and the ignoble. These are the things that we disagree about. And not only do we disagree about them, Socrates gets Euthyphro to say that the gods disagree about these and get angry with each other over those. And these are the things that we're often mistaken about. And these are the things that often get involved in all sorts of other issues, right? So we think that we're having a discussion about how to sort the groceries and put them away in the cupboard, but it's really about right and wrong, or beautiful and ugly, or other things. And then once we get into a meta level and we start, disagreeing with each other about who's being unreasonable or who's arguing, then there's even more possibility for that. Plato does not offer us an awful lot of guidance when it comes to what we can do about our anger. But what he does say in broad strokes is that we need to temper that middle part of the soul, especially those of us in whom that's particularly developed or acute, or however you want to put it, right? That those of us who struggle with it, like in myself. Interestingly, his proposals for how to do this have to do primarily not with intellectual things as such. So it's not like go read a book on anger management or something like that. Instead, what he's going to tell us is that we need music, which works upon the soul in different ways. This is discussed in Republic, Book 2 and 3. And we also need what the Greeks called gymnastike, exercise. And there's probably something to that. So I'm going to leave Plato off for the time being, right? And now we'll jump into the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle has a lot to say about anger. He doesn't have a treatise on anger, but his treatment of anger is really the first systematic attempt to understand it. And it's at a couple different levels. He talks about it at a biological level, which he doesn't really go that much into. And I don't think is that very helpful for us, because we no longer think about, for humors and anger as blood boiling around the heart or anything like that. But then he talks about it at a psychological level in great depth and detail, and not just in one work. He talks about it in the Rhetoric. He talks about it in the Two Ethics. He talks about it to some degree in the Politics, On the Soul. There's a lot of different, also in the Topics, there's a lot of places where he goes into what's going on with us psychologically when we get angry, and how does anger work, and what does it try to do, and how can you provoke it, and how can you calm it. And then there's what we can call a moral level, a third higher level, where we're evaluating anger in terms of both, anger in situations and anger as a disposition, which could be excessive or it could be, defective. Aristotle does think that the virtue of praotes, which I'll also write down here, which we translate sometimes as calmness, or good temper, gentleness. Interestingly, in New Testament Greek and in the Septuagint, it's translated as meek. And it's used not only of the meek, like in the Gospels, but also to describe Moses, who I think if you think about the narratives concerning him, you would not actually consider him to be meek, but he is a person who gets angry, in sort of an Aristotelian way at the right time for the right reasons, to the right amount. Now, somebody will point out, of course, that he didn't enter the Holy Land because he got too angry at the Israelites at a certain point, and that's true, right? Not claiming that he's a paragon of Aristotelian virtue, but it does illustrate the meaning of this term. And so Aristotle actually gives us a lot of very useful insights into how we can understand our own anger and the anger of other people, and how we could evaluate whether we're getting angry to the right amount, with the right people. He doesn't give us exercises in the way that the Stoics will, but the Aristotelian tradition is a very important one when it comes to understanding anger. And unfortunately, we've lost some of the texts within that tradition. We do have some interesting discussions by later Aristotelians, like his student and friend and successor, Theophrastus, about that as well. So that's a good introduction to the Aristotelian part. Then let's talk about the Stoics. So when we get to the Stoics, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of what they wrote left. And I'm sure that, there are entire treatises on the emotions. I think we would have a lot more material to work with if we did possess more of the Stoic text. But even what we do have with Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Aristotemus' epitome of Stoic ethics, the discussions in Cicero, the discussions in Diogenes Laertes, the bits of Musonius Rufus that we have, and the little bits of Heracles that we have, we can put them together into a great composite picture. And we see that the Stoics did think that anger was always something bad. So they're different than Plato or Aristotle. And Plato and Aristotle didn't think anger was always good. They thought a lot of the time it could be quite bad. But the Stoics thought it was always bad because it was an emotion that didn't really serve any useful purpose that reason couldn't deal with. And it's very disturbing. So what's really good about the Stoics, and why I use them so much in my own writing on this and my practice and my work with clients, is you can see my dog wandering around in the back there. She's been whining she was up on the bed, and now she's wandering around. Anyway, back to my own practice. Why do I find the Stoics so interesting? They have some really good techniques, some strategies that you can use. So I'm going to give you just a little glimpse of them. One is what is, in very fancy terms, and I'll write this down for you as well, called the premeditatio malorum. This will be familiar to some of you. I almost misspelled premeditatio. Wouldn't that be terrible if I'm teaching it and getting it wrong? Basically, what this means is thinking about potentially bad things that you think are bad, before they happen. And so if you know that you're going to be going into a meeting and dealing with people who are, always a pain in the ass to you, you can think to yourself, why do I allow myself to get so upset about this? What's it going to be like going in there? And it helps to prime you for that, because you also think about what resources you might have to deal with the situation. And I've used this with clients, from people who are chronically enraged all the way up to people at the executive level who just need to get an edge and not lose it during meetings, and to be able to express themselves well. And so this is a very adaptable exercise. Another thing, and I'm going to be a little facetious here, we'll call it "you poor bastard," and it comes from Epictetus. And Epictetus has a whole chapter discussing anger, where he says, why are you getting angry at people? Why do you dislike people so much? You call this person a thief and this person this and this person this, and you get all riled up with them. Don't you understand that they're doing what they're doing because that seems good or reasonable to them? Now they're screwed up, Epictetus isn't saying, well, because they think it's good for them, it therefore is good. He's not a relativist. He's saying that's exactly why you shouldn't be like them. They're screwed up. Is it going to help you to be screwed up in return? You think that's a successful strategy? Now, what he actually says is, listen, you can realize that what they're doing that makes you angry is because they think that's reasonable for them to do. That's a sign of how things are for them. You don't have to become angry. You can instead say to yourself, don't say to the person, of course, oh, you poor bastard. You think that it's smart to bully me? And then when you do that, you find part of what Stoicism provides, and actually part of what any intentional way of approaching things provides, is a certain sort of disengagement that allows you then to get an insight about what's going on within your own psyche, your own personality, your relations, the narratives that you're telling. And then you can make choices. Oh, I want to go this way instead of this way. Let me tell you about I'll tell you about two other traditions. So the Epicureans, they also had some interesting discussions of anger. There's already some in Epicurus. It's very unfortunate that we've lost almost everything that Epicurus wrote as well, because wouldn't we love to be able to read it? But we do have a few other things. Lucretius talks about anger in On the Nature of Things. And then we do have this guy, Philodemus. And Philodemus, unfortunately, the scroll on anger was damaged when they first started trying to unroll it. And we don't have the entire thing. But what we do have is really interesting. See, the Stoics would oppose the Aristotelians and say, the Aristotelians, they've got it totally wrong when it comes to anger. The Epicureans said, both of you guys do. You Stoics, you're at one extreme. You Aristotelians, you're at another. We Epicureans, we're right in the middle. And we're, looking at it, the way that he framed it was in terms of natural anger, and then, what we could call vain or empty or wrong-headed, or however you want to translate it, anger. And so, the Epicureans thought there was a natural reaction, and we do have to get angry with some people some of the time to you might say, protect ourselves. But much of what we get angry about comes from empty opinions, kenodoxia. And so if we can manage to disengage ourselves from a lot of the things that do, in fact, get us riled up because we're too invested in them, we're not going to get angry all that often. And we'll get angry when we need to be. I'll mention, too, that in early Christian thought, anger was a particularly troubling emotion. And, no big surprise, they're struggling with the same issues as a community that everybody else is. But it gets a little bit more complicated, because the ones who are doing, high-level Christian theology or doing Christian philosophy, like Lactantius and Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, and we can go on and on and on. These are guys who actually studied ancient philosophy. They know what the Aristotelians have to say. They know what the Epicureans have to say. They know what Plato says. They know what Plutarch says. They know all these different things. And they're also trying to make sense of it in light of Scripture. And in Scripture, you get a couple different things coming up. One is the Sermon on the Mount, right? Where there's this three-part discussion of anger. And it comes up in the context of reinterpretation of the law, where Christ says to these crowds, I haven't come to change the law, I'm actually giving you something that's a little bit tougher here. Again, paraphrasing, right? Because this is like Alciora 44 asks, what chapter of the Discourses did Epictetus say, you poor bastards? I told you as I was talking about it. He doesn't say that. I'm paraphrasing, right? So paraphrasing very roughly, Christ says, the law says, don't commit adultery. If you look at a woman with lust in your heart, then you're committing adultery. Then he switches immediately to talking about killing. Law says don't kill, don't commit murder. But I tell you, and then there's this discussion about anger. If you're angry with your brother, if you call him a fool, and so there's a question about, okay, does that mean that anger is like totally off limits? And interestingly, a gloss got into there, and in some of the manuscripts, it actually says, if you get angry with your brother without reason, and then others just say if you become angry with your brother. And so Christian writers are going back and forth about this, and you will see Christian writers criticizing each other on this. John Cassian will bring up those people who say, they inserted that gloss. John Cassian's at one extreme. Anger is always bad. The only anger that's ever good for you is getting angry at yourself over your own vices. Augustine says, well, sometimes anger can actually be quite useful. We got to really watch it because it has a tendency to morph into hatred if we're not careful. John Chrysostom talks about it. There's actually a really interesting piece by a guy called Lactantius. And Lactantius is writing officially about the anger of God, right? Because how do you make sense out of that? If God gets angry, what the hell does that mean, right? But he spends a lot of time talking about human anger, and he directly compares his position to that of the Aristotelians, the Epicureans, and the Stoics. It's a piece that I've long wanted to do some work on, and if I ever do have the time, I want to write quite a bit about Lactantius and anger and that whole idea that he's working with. So very interesting stuff. And they had, they engage in a lot of, throughout this entire tradition, there's all these different images of what the angry person is like and how the angry person might be able to get a handle on what's going on within their head, so that they can, get the anger under control or channel it in the right way, or over time, changing one's habits, become a less angry person. I'll tell you too, before I start answering questions, why am I so interested in this? Because I'm an angry person. Just like an alcoholic who will always be an alcoholic, even though I've improved in how I handle my angry disposition, I still struggle with it quite a bit. And it's caused a lot of problems for me in the course of my life, and not just problems for me, but other people who have to deal with me, right? And so I became interested in it while I was still in graduate school. And it was kind of a piecemeal thing, and I could see what was going on in Aristotle. I also found the Stoics useful. I was interested in what was going on with, these Christian writers. And I was trying to apply some of it to my own life, and I was also trying to get a sort of theoretical handle on what is going on here. And at the same time, I was also like using resources that I was finding in contemporary psychology, and it was really surprising to me how much of that was either not as good or was just sort of repeating with a little bit of additional stuff what the ancients had already had to teach us. So it was, that became sort of a fascination with me. And so really my research into anger has been going back, close to 20 years. I probably should have written my dissertation about it, but I didn't. I wrote on other stuff. And eventually, I've written a few things here and there, but eventually I do need to get these books that I want done. So, all right, now I'm going to start taking questions. I'm going to start with this one here from Robert. Thanks so much for your videos. Love Kierkegaard. Yeah, Kierkegaard is an interesting guy. He has a lot to say about the emotions in particular. All right, so let me jump up to this. Francis, is there a difference between intellectual anger and purely emotional anger? I don't know what intellectual anger would be as opposed to emotional anger. And here's the interesting thing that the ancients pointed out. There is no such thing as purely emotional anger. Anger already as a human emotion, as opposed to just a merely animal response, involves all sorts of higher level cognition. That's part of why Plato I think, wanted to say that it's not just an appetite, like wanting to get laid or, stuff your face full of food or get drunk or something like that. He said it's in this middle part of the soul because it involves conceptions of justice and injustice. It oftentimes engages in planning and all sorts of other things along these lines. I hear the dog whining downstairs. Come up, Amika. Come on. She wants to get up the stairs, but she's old and it takes her a while to do so. So we'll see if she just whines down there and how long she does it, or if she actually, spurs herself into action. If you desire something strongly enough, good example, animals, they will eventually do things. But yeah, this is why anger is so dangerous. It hijacks or seduces our higher faculties. It brings them in and uses them. And oftentimes then blinds us to what's going on. Aristotle says anger is like a hasty servant who listens to half of the instructions and then rushes off to do them. So anger sees that there is some sort of thing that could be perceived as an insult or slight, and it carries out a reasoning process. He actually uses the word syllogozein to syllogize. It syllogizes that that we ought to go take revenge on that person. Pardue. I'm an Indian student going through books of Ayn Rand, intended to learn philosophy. So please tell me the way to learn philosophy, recommend initial books. Well, don't start with Rand, because Rand is going to steer you wrong about nearly all of the history of philosophy. I don't think that she's not worth reading, but there's so many other people who are better to read. And also, when it comes to studying the history of philosophy, there's a lot of kind of tendentious histories of philosophy out there. So you want to find somebody who's reliable. Cobbleston is good middle of the road kind of stuff. Let me actually write that down for those of you that are interested. He was sort of the standard when I was in grad school, Friedrich Cobbleston. Don't use Russell's history of philosophy. I mean, Russell's interesting, and I actually do work on him because he's an interesting guy in his own right. But again, bad historian of philosophy. Don't use Hegel's history of philosophy either, unless you're really interested in Hegel, because you're only going to get his take on it. So where do you begin? Start reading Plato. I mean, and don't feel like, I got to go back to the pre-Socratics first. No, just start reading Plato. And then read some Aristotle, then read some Stoics. Start going through it in sequence, I would say. I mean, that's not the only way you can do philosophy, but that's the advice that I pretty consistently give people. So Ashley has something very nice here. Hope you and your wife are feeling better. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we've been struggling with this flu that it on average has, lingered with most people for about 6 weeks. And I kind of poo-pooed that idea at first, and then realized after a while of losing, time because of working really hard and then being totally exhausted, that I needed to take it a bit more carefully, and that I needed to believe that this flu thing was for real. Plus I'm 47 years old, so I can't bounce back as quickly from illnesses. But I am feeling better. I still am not fully up to snuff, but I did manage to get 4 workouts in this week. Rather proud of that. And I did manage to shoot about, 7 or 8 videos this week. That's always exhausting for me. I'll probably feel a bit exhausted after this because it's kind of a high intensity thing. And I have another meeting later on today. So, all right. Socrates, Plato says, I saw on your bookshelf that you had some Bataille. What do you think of him? Yeah, Bataille's an interesting guy. I generally have not enjoyed interacting with Bataille scholars, but I find Bataille interesting, just not interesting enough to spend an awful lot of time with. Let's see what else we got here. Zuhandenheit, I'm sure you're being tired of asked about Deleuze often, but I wonder if you had any thoughts about his connections and influence concerning Stoicism. Well, he has no influence whatsoever when it comes to Stoicism. You're asking about the influence of Stoicism on Deleuze, I imagine, right? I mean, So here's the thing. This is one of the things one of my professors pointed out to me when I was like bringing Deleuze into all these modern philosophy classes, because he had this great book on Leibniz and Spinoza and all that. And I actually presented Deleuze's Nietzsche book to our graduate students. You're always getting more Deleuze than you are the thinker he's writing about. So, you know, he is bringing up the Stoics, but he's doing very, very different stuff than the Stoics were doing. I mean, you know, think about the conception of nature and the role that it plays in Stoicism, and think about, you know, Deleuze's concept of the rhizome and all of that. They just don't fit in with each other. So think about Deleuze as more like taking other philosophers as kind of like launching pads for his own projects, I would say. Francis asked, do you think there's techniques of emotional mastery unique to self-help that can aid people in developing and actualizing more preferable emotions without the aid of philosophy alone? I got to think about how, okay, so are there techniques of emotional mastery unique to self-help? No. Self-help is kind of a melange of, you know, things from psychology, philosophy, theology, this and that. Self-help is just, you know, and self-help ranges from the crappiest crap all the way up to some really great stuff, but it's just really just a catch-all category. Now, that can aid people in developing and actualizing more preferable emotions. Yeah, sure. But without the aid of philosophy alone, I don't even know what that means. If that means not just relying on philosophy, well, if you're just relying on philosophy, you're doing bad philosophy, because the Aristotelian tradition, you know, you check out everybody else's stuff. Plato is constantly drawing on other people's stuff. You know, the Stoics, you know, to do philosophy is not just to sort of retreat into your own little domain, although academic philosophy is often like that. You know, if Aristotle were around today, if Thomas Aquinas were around today, if the Stoics were around today, they would in fact be engaging with modern psychology, what sociology has to tell us. You know, now they wouldn't be doing it in an uncritical way. They wouldn't be, for example, you know, swallowing entire things from evolutionary psychology or you know, emergent fields like that without, you know, looking at those things very critically. But yeah, I mean, I think it's best to take kind of an approach that draws on what we've got in philosophy that's particularly good, and then also draws on other resources that we have. You know, I think that's important. All right, let me take one from Pygmalion. When it comes to learning a new language like German to read philosophy, should I just gain the vocabulary by jumping into the text immediately, or should I look for other resources? Well, I mean, if you haven't actually got German down, first you need to learn the grammar and the vocabulary. And so that's going to take you, it should take you like a, you know, if it's a year, a very intensive year, probably a couple years. Then you can start reading literature, and philosophy can be part of that literature. But even, you know, when you're reading, you know, stuff in, you know, for reading it for philosophy, you do want to also like learn the literature, because the people that you're writing or the people you're reading are also in, you know, reading that same literature. So, you know, like if you're going to learn French to read Descartes, I mean, you actually need to learn Latin because he wrote more in Latin than in French. But let's say you're going to learn French to read Descartes, you would also want to read the other people writing in French at the time to get something, get an idea of the context, right? So yeah, and I will point out too, if you want to learn the old German script, then you want to get yourself an old, like, teach yourself German, like the one that I used. And it's very useful to be able to read the old German script, the Fraktur, because so few other people can read it. So it puts you in a kind of a different class. All right, let's scroll back up and see what we got here. Carl writes, the example about going into a meeting where people make you furious is way too relatable for me right now. Yeah, I think you're not unique in that. Meetings are terrible quite often. Randy writes, the best revenge is to not be like that. That's playing off the Epictetus thing. You know, it's still considering it to be revenge. It's still kind of reactive. Namsism. What does Epictetus say about jealousy as related to anger? Not much. He doesn't talk about, and we want to also distinguish envy. Are you talking about envy or jealousy? Because those are two different things. Jealousy is when you want to keep other people's hands off of your stuff. Like, you're jealous of your spouse. You're jealous of your position. Envy is when you want what somebody else has. He does talk about envy, and he says that it's always going to cause you problems. He doesn't associate it immediately with anger, but what he does connect it with is in a chapter on contentiousness, on the contentious and the brutal. Contentious is people who are driven into conflict. And he says, look, if you want what other people have and they want what you have, you're going to be in conflict. Or if you both want the same thing. If you're too obsessed with externals, like if you're all fighting for who's going to dominate the conversation or who's going to have the corner office or whose lawn is the best or something like that, you're going to get in arguments with them. You're going to fight with them. He says, in a case like that, a father is hoping for a son is hoping for his father to die so he can get the farm. Rocco, any mention about anger related to relationship? So yeah, I mean, if we're talking about the ancients, they do talk about people getting angry in relationships. Aristotle has a very funny example where he's talking about this guy. He's talking about it in terms of justice and injustice. This guy who's from an anger-prone family, and the sons abuse the fathers, and the son says it's okay for me to drag my father by the hair to the threshold because that's how far he dragged his father. Right? Well, there's a structure of a relationship. I think here's something that I've been devoting a lot of thought to and I've been using with clients. When we think about virtue ethics, we often think in terms of changing habits. And so we pay attention to our habits. So people do journaling, right? For example, and they're like, okay, how many times did I lose my temper today? And they set up, if they're doing psychiatric stuff, we set up a treatment plan and, how can we make this measurable and all that? That's important. Habit is really central. Equally central and interpenetrating with habits are two other dimensions. One of them is relationships. If you wind up having the same fights with different people in different contexts, you're probably the thing that's holding it all together. And so you want to look at the kind of relationships that you're choosing or finding yourself in. The other thing is narrative, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, who other people are, the way the world works. All of those kind of fuse in together. So I think those are important. Bourgeois, you helped me with anger. You helped me with my anger with your videos. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. It's always a surprise to me that videos can't be helpful because they're not helpful for me when I watch other people's videos. But if they help you, I'm glad to hear that. Here's a good one from J to B to Nick. Is there any noticeable difference between how Aquinas views anger compared to Aristotle? So that's a great question. So Aquinas is taking Aristotle, John of Damascene, Augustine, a bunch of other thinkers, and bringing them all together in a synthesis. Aquinas he's got a different anthropology than Aristotle does. As a matter of fact, he manages, I think, in some respects, to get Aristotle's psychology wrong. And he what he calls the will, the voluntas, Thomas Aquinas, really is closer to what Aristotle is calling proairesis. It's not what Aristotle calls boulesis, which then gets translated as rational appetite. But that's a very obscure point, right? Aquinas does have a really great discussion about anger, and I draw upon some of his insights. One of the advances that I think Aquinas makes is identifying that anger is really fundamentally about what we call difficult goods. That is, goods that in order to achieve, we have to face some sort of difficulty, we have to endure problems, we have to struggle against resistance. Anger is concerned with that part of us. This in some ways connects it more closely to Plato. Let me take a pause. Amika, come up. Come on. Come up here. Don't whine down there. Come on up. As the dogs get older, they get goofier and goofier and goofier. All right, let me go with this. An ordered whole. Most people struggle with emotions because of how it affects other people. Do you think philosophers also frame it as how emotions affect reason as if it is another person? Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, I think the reason why most people wind up seeking treatment for their or therapy or working on their emotions is not usually just because of how it feels for them. And I think with anxiety, I'd say people who have anxiety often do seek things out for their own sake. People who are depressed, people who are angry, it's often other people saying, wow, you got to go and see somebody. You got to talk with somebody. Do philosophers frame it as how emotions affect reason as if it's another person? I've never seen that. Although Aristotle does have a really interesting discussion about the parts of the soul and justice, where he's like, well, you can be just to yourself because you're kind of like a community of parts. So there's something kind of like that, but yeah. All right, so there's two things here about Buddhists. Do you have any favorite Buddhist thinkers? And then principled uncertainty, Buddhists are scared of life. That's not a nice thing to say. I know principled uncertainty is somebody that we've talked quite a bit, but so I think he's probably joking there. But do I have any favorite Buddhist thinkers? No, because I don't read a lot of contemporary Buddhist stuff. And that's mainly just from being too busy on my part. I've read Buddhist scriptures and they're interesting stuff, but I wouldn't say I have anything that's favorites. Chase says, any general thoughts on political anger or dealing with political anger? Well, that's a good one. So, Aristotle has a lot to say about that. I think the Stoics, Plutarch, Cicero have useful things to say about that. The same general dynamics that affect individuals that make them angry can apply to groups. And quite often, we get what the ancients called stasis. I'm going to write that down for you too. And stasis is usually translated as faction, but you can think of it as social breakdown. It's a fundamental political theory problem. Something like Hobbes is very interested in too. And yeah, anger plays an incredibly important role in that. Anger can be used to motivate people. I mean, we've seen this, right, with Facebook. Posts that get people riled up, they are easiest to go viral. And many of them can be political. And, one of the dangers with anger is anger tends to make the people who are feeling it see things with a kind of tunnel vision, not really take account of the consequences of what they're saying or doing. They're often unfair to the people that they're angry with, and it often spills over in other people. I've had so many Facebook conversations where I just give up on the conversation because somebody who's worked up about something takes me to be saying something that I'm not saying just because I'm pointing out that they're not totally right about something. I'm on the other side. Anger does tend to do that. And I think in recent times, anger has become a noxious force on both sides of the political spectrum here in the United States. And it's a serious issue. Now, learning how to deal with it, or perhaps you might even say surf on the wave of anger. Do philosophers have anything useful to say about that? I think they do. Here's a good question. Rocco. Do you think anger is closely related to our need to control external reality, then respond with it when we fail? Yeah, quite often. And this is something where I think the Stoics are really helpful for us. And that notion of the dichotomy of control, right? Anger tends to be about things that we don't really have control over, like other people's thoughts and views on us. And interestingly, anger, it's not just that in terms of response, but also in terms of what anger then leads us to do. Anger makes us feel as if we can control things more than we can. This is why people like to be angry rather than being afraid or hurt or sad or anxious, or you can pick all sorts of other, or embarrassed, right? It's easier to feel angry because then you get, worked up, right? Oftentimes the angry person does attempt to assert control, and they don't have control over themselves. And you want to get somebody angrier, tell them, hey, man, you're out of control, get control over yourself. Then they get even angrier. All right. Retro Gamer says, cheers. Thanks. That's very nice of you. All right, let me go up a bit now. So Rabbit says political anger is a leveling. It can be. Leveling is a term that Kierkegaard uses, is similar to what Nietzsche calls ressentiment, and sometimes they can be connected together. Sometimes they're not. Martin Luther King actually had some interesting things to say about anger. You can find it in a blog post on my blog, Arexis de Noetique, about righteous anger in political life. Let's see here. Principled uncertainty, anger, used well, can facilitate justice. Yeah, it can. And I think that's why Plato, so early on, was interested in figuring out how do we harness it well. Now, again, this is where like the Platonists and the Aristotelians are on one side, the Stoics are on another. Seneca says, listen, anything that you can do with anger motivating you, you can do with practical reason motivating you as well, and then you won't go, off the right path in doing so. Hail Mary asks, is it wrong to simply start with the core books? We're back to like, what should I do in philosophy? When I did my undergrad, starting with the Greeks and Enlightenment thought was the best. I mean, you can start with whatever you want, right? It's your life. It's your studies. One of the things too is you're going to go back and rework things. So if you want to start with the Greeks and then jump over the medievals and go straight to, skip the early moderns and go straight into the Enlightenment, sure, you can do that. But then, you probably do want to go back sometime and read Boethius and read Lactantius and read Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and Anselm and all these other people that you're missing. All right. Chino Ashray, can you please talk about philosophical therapy as a profession? Well, that's an interesting thing, yeah. So I guess there's a couple things to say. One is this was part of what philosophy was doing early on. You can look at what Plato is attempting to do and what Socrates was attempting to do as a kind of therapy, right? Aristotle himself is not doing that, although his works can certainly be used for that. The Stoics were clearly doing that. The Epicureans clearly doing that. Even the skeptics and the early Christian writers are doing that as well. So this concept of therapeia, it's going on for a long time. And another way we talk about this is philosophy as a way of life, right? And that continues really all the way on into the early modern period. I was just, looking at Descartes. You see him on the chalkboard there because I'm shooting some videos on the discourse. Descartes' philosophy is a way of life. It's not just abstract stuff. He's trying to rework things for a way in which one could live a rational, coherent life, right? And that continues on until philosophy becomes overly, specialized and academic. Now, what about the present, right? Part of what I do, so my official title is philosophical counselor, because I am an APPA, that's American Philosophical Practitioners Association, certified philosophical counselor. But, I'm equally happy calling it philosophical coaching, philosophical practice. I don't usually call it philosophical therapy because of the association of therapy here with something medical, but I could just as well call it that. And so what I do is I work with clients, and a good bit of what I do is what a counselor or spiritual director would be doing, is listening and responding. But I bring to bear resources coming out of philosophy, and I do this with clients who are just individual people struggling with things. I do this in terms of executive coaching. And there's others out there like me doing that. And, there's entire societies, here in the United States and Canada and Europe and other places. And so it's kind of it's a cool profession. I really enjoy it. I was doing it before I actually got certified. And that's why I got certified, because people were coming to me and they'd be like, hey, I've got this problem. Can we talk about it? And I found myself doing more and more of that and finding, the philosophers who I was studying to be very useful resources for others. And it's great when you see things like that click and people, using philosophy to work on their life problems. Uncle Jam, nothing wrong with Ayn Rand. Really may be a better place to start, if anything. Aristotle's good, though. Totally wrong. Rand is a terrible historian of philosophy. You want to start with her? Go ahead. But, speaking as somebody who actually teaches Rand and is one of the few philosophers who thinks that there's some merit to her ideas, no, you don't begin with her, nor do you rely on her for verdicts of other philosophers. And Aristotle is good. Aristotle is way better, although I don't suggest starting with Aristotle. Hugh, why do philosophical therapy when you can read the philokalia? Okay, then read the philokalia. They'll tell you that you probably need a spiritual director, right? So you're going to do philosophical therapy anyway. So, all right. I'm going to skip down a bit. Francis, what makes you not a Hegelian? How do you think the method of immanent critique is too simple? I didn't say the method of immanent critique is too simple, but I don't think that's what makes you a Hegelian. I'm not a Hegelian, just like I'm not a Aristotelian or a Stoic. I'm an eclectic. I draw on a variety of different thinkers and approaches, and I bring them together. I mean, you could say, well, then you're really a Hegelian because you're doing something dialectical. Yeah, but so is Aristotle, and so is Thomas Aquinas. So, yeah. Yasmin, I missed your part on anger. Can you summarize? I cannot summarize. I spent about, probably 15, 20 minutes talking about it. This is a video that'll be available afterwards, so that's really easy to access. JR, do you like Anthony Kenny's 4-volume history of philosophy? I think it's great, with a caveat to splitting the more in-depth discussions into topical chapters isn't always the best approach. I have not looked at it for a very long time, so I don't really have much to say about it. I can tell you one thing, that Kenny was one of the translators of the Blackfriars edition of Aquinas' treatise on the emotions. Not such a good translation, but Kenny's an interesting person. I can tell you one thing: McIntyre, who I've had the opportunity to talk with, speaks of him very highly. So I don't know if that means anything to you, but yeah. Robert, how are emotions represented as a phenomenological interpretation? Well, I'm not sure what's being asked there. You're asking what phenomenologists make of emotions? Depends on the phenomenologist. Heidegger treats them in terms of mood, attunement. He's actually got some discussions of them in many of his different treatises. Max Scheler, that whole sequence, like running through von Hildenbrand all the way up to Adrian Pepperzak, I would say, are very focused on the emotions. You get other phenomenologists like Solomon writing entire books on the emotions, Gabriel Marcel. So there's no one phenomenological treatment of the emotions. There's a whole bunch of very interesting, very insightful things. Mr. Dharampaji, I often feel mental and physically exhausted after hours and hours of thinking. It even produces a severe amount of anxiety when I encounter difficulties which seem unsolvable. Help. Well, then if you can turn it off, don't do hours and hours of thinking. Descartes, actually, who's a brilliant thinker, said that we can only really think with the pure intellect as opposed to using the imagination and mixing these things together for maybe an hour at a time. and that maybe only once a month or so. So, you don't have to place the pressure upon yourself that you have to resolve philosophical problems. Sometimes it takes years and years to sort your way through it, So I would say if you can take that pressure off yourself, that will probably help you out. Here's an interesting one. Corbo, what does Nietzsche mean by décadence? He's using the French term there, which just means decadence in English. I can never figure out what he means by that term. Everyone and everything seems decadent to him. Well, not everything is decadent, but there are many things that are decadent. And decadence is simply when you decline from one period to the next, or an organism or a social group declines in some of its, impulses, reactions. And Nietzsche thought that much of European culture was decadent in that way. He thought of, movements towards democracy, for example, as a type of decadence. It just means, a degeneration. And Nietzsche was not, unique in using this term. A lot of other people are using that term as well. So, Robert, do you draw any links between Dostoevsky's and Kierkegaard's view of faith? Well, I can't say that I know what Dostoevsky's view of faith actually is. I can say that I know what Dostoevsky's characters' views are, and they're all over the map, right? But I mean, so let's talk about Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard thinks that faith, in at least one sense, is not just sort of like a dumb belief for people who can't think, or it's just a starting point, the way that people at his time were making it. The people that were he's attacking as Hegelians. He calls faith sort of this leap, right, into something that he thinks is there, but you don't know is really there until you encounter it. And he calls faith, a passion. And it's not something that you can sort of universalize and put on to everybody. What I do like, I'll say this. This won't really answer the question as such, but it may give you a little bit of insight. I like religious thinkers for whom religion didn't make anything simpler. So I like Kierkegaard, I like Dostoevsky, I like Gabriel Marcel, I like thinkers like that. Even Thomas Aquinas, why does he write a whole Summa Theologia among the other works? Because things are complicated. Because when you introduce God or the human relation to God and faith into the picture, it doesn't. There's some people who are like, oh, well, God's in his heaven, the Bible's in my hands, now everything falls into place. That's clearly not what these religious thinkers think. G.K. Chesterton would be another great example of somebody in that boat as well. No, it makes the whole world more tricky, more complicated. And I think that you could say that about Dostoevsky. People who are struggling, people who wrestle with God, those are the religious thinkers I'm interested in. All right. Jan, are there any positive uses for anger? Well, I think there are. This is something where I differ from the Stoics, and I also differ from Cicero, who I like very much. And I also differ from John Damascene, who I like not John Damascene. Now I'm blanking on his name. The other John. Anyway, we'll come back to that in a moment. I think that anger can be useful. I'm more Aristotelian in that respect, but I think we have to be very, very, very careful with it. I think that if you want it to be useful, you do need to go through some sort of tempering process. You need to sort of, compare your notes with others. Again, to bring up the example of Martin Luther King, one of the things that the marchers actually did to prepare themselves for the crap that they were going to be put through by white racists when they were marching for civil rights was they would actually have a gauntlet that they would walk. And during this gauntlet, they would role play the sort of things that would be said against you, and they would push you around. And if you lost your temper, you didn't get to march because, that would not be serving a useful purpose. All right, Mr. Dajampaji has a follow-up. How do I stop myself from getting anxious while reading philosophy? I often feel mentally exhausted and anxious when I can't visualize some concepts, especially when reading Hegel. Well, I guess the one place to start is to remind yourself that, to begin with, Hegel thinks that if you are visualizing the stuff, that's still in the realm of representation. It's conceptual thinking, but you don't need to visualize everything. Again, you can take the pressure off of yourself. You don't need to understand everything. Understanding is something that builds over time and is to some degree contingent. And, you know, in a way, it can be counterproductive to be anxious about getting it right or fully understanding it. That can often prevent you from, you know, having the openness to the ideas to where they suddenly start making sense. And here's another thing too. You know, I'll talk about my experience with Anselm. You know, Anselm's ontological argument. He never calls it ontological, by the way. That's later on. That's Kant in his language. In Proslogion 2, and then in 3 and 4. And the whole Proslogion is actually the unum argumentum, by the way. I'll read it, and sometimes I'm like, wow, yeah, now I finally see it. It all makes sense. And then I have to explain it to somebody, and I'm like, oh, well, maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe I'm missing something here. And then it like grows upon me, and it's like, hey, think about this idea. Think about this idea. Now, I bring that one up for two reasons. One is if you read Anselm's Proslogion and you read the preface, he struggled with it in the same way, right? The other thing is Bertrand Russell himself at one time went through something quite similar with that. So you don't have to place so much pressure on yourself to like totally get everything and understand everything. Maybe you need to ration it out for yourself. All right, let me go. We're at time, but I'm going to go on a little bit longer since we have more questions. Retro Gamer, isn't anger a manifestation of the intuition of an injustice? It's a manifestation of the perception or the imagination. This is what Aristotle would say, and the Stoics follow him in this, of injustice. Intuition, that can mean too many different things. Now, one can be wrong in perceiving that there's an injustice there, right? One can be wrong in imagining, fantasia. One can be wrong in that sort of thing. So quite often people do get angry about stuff that's not really unjust. Like, you know, when you have to, somebody does something wrong, you actually punish them or hold them, you know, to standards, and then they get all ticked off with you. It happens with me with students all the time. Why didn't you give me full points on this? You know, because you didn't earn them, you know, because you didn't do all the work I told you to do. Oh, that's terrible. You shouldn't do that. What are you getting angry about? I didn't commit injustice. I gave you everything you needed, and you didn't measure up. You know, that happens a lot. Robert, were the Stoics against self-defense in war? Were they pacifists? I mean, that one's easy to answer. Look at Stoics. Were they? Was Cato against self-defense in war? Was any of the other ones? How about Marcus Aurelius? No, clearly not. I mean, if you read through the Stoic stuff, this will help you with that. Corbo, what do you think about the way we treat the animals we eat? Chickens, cows, pigs, and so on. I think factory farming is terrible. And I think that we've unfortunately made it very difficult for anybody who wants to ethically farm animals to do so in a way that can compete with factory farming. Factory farming is terrible for the animals. It's terrible for the people who are working there. It's a huge problem, and they are very, very good at lobbying and getting laws passed. So that's a big problem. Mr. Dharampaji again, what do you think about the self-hermeneutic method as used by Carl Jung to interpret his visions and their manifestations in Indian mythology? I don't know enough about it to say anything, so there's not much I can say there. Let's see. All right, we've got a lot of other questions, so I'm going to have to start skipping through things. Let's see. Pit big guns. Should we try not to be angry at all? That'd be nice. That's really, really, really a high standard. If you can, stop being angry about stupid stuff, that's probably a very good idea. Robert, is there a difference between aggressiveness and anger? Yeah. There's all sorts of differences. Aggressivity is a broader category that overlaps with anger. You can be aggressive without being angry. You can be a sadist who enjoys inflicting things on people. You could be a thief who likes stealing other people's things and hurting them in that way, right? In order to hold, do you know any philosophers who are angry in their writing? The only one I can say is possibly Nietzsche. No, there's different people who write angrily, I suppose you could say, at different points. Nietzsche doesn't really strike me as angry so much. Maybe in parts. I guess Lev Shestov, sometimes. Who else? I don't know. I'd have to think about that, All right. Mihailo, how should we understand Aristotle's terms praotes in terms of good amount of anger? He did say the Greek language does not have precise words for these conceptions. Great work. He didn't say that it doesn't have it for praos. He says the Greek language doesn't have precise terms for some things, and he gives you new terms for those. How should we understand praotes? You can. Here's where I'm going to refer you to the videos, right? And if you look up in the top corner, there you click. There's a playlist with a whole bunch of videos. I've talked about this at great length in a number of different presentations. It's that middle disposition. The person who's praos is there. They get angry at the right time for the right reason with the right people to the right amount, et cetera, and it's guided by reason. Oh, here's a good disidentity. How do you keep your cool while driving, especially when somebody drives way slower than allowed or puts you in life or death situation, but nothing happens? What's the Stoic answer? This is something actually that I'm writing a piece about because this is something I do get angry about. I don't like people. I really hate people driving slow in the left lane, and so there are some Stoic techniques that you can use to help yourself while traveling. It is a big source of anger. So, pit big guns. What should we do in order to have philosophy as a way of life? What exactly is philosophy as a way of life? What it sounds like, you take philosophy, you try to live it out. It's experiential, it's experimental. You use resources, you apply them over time. You see what insights you get from them. It's something that's been part of philosophy from the very beginning. And we can go on and on and on with that, right? What do we have to do in order to have philosophy as a way of life? Start studying people who looked at philosophy as a way of life. Start applying it. If you're in an area where you can you want to try out Stoicism, find a Stoic fellowship, find a meetup group, talk with other people. I think that's important with that. All right, Maximo, how does the hypothetical absence of free will affect views about anger? Should we be angry at all if it was inevitable? So the hypothetical absence of free will is saying that we didn't have free will, I guess. Well, if that's the case, then we could say then we shouldn't be angry at people. But then again, if you don't have any free will, you're just as fated to be angry, aren't you? So it doesn't matter. Once you take free will out of the picture, you lose an awful lot. All right, I'm going to skip down past the Jordan Peterson stuff. A lot of discussion there. Artavan, where on the spectrum do you fall politically? I'm off the spectrum. People have sometimes misquoted me on this. I'm too traditional to be a conservative. I'm too radical to be a liberal. So sometimes people get that a little bit garbled. Another great way of putting it is I'm an Aristotelian. I think that both the left and the right are mostly crap. There's some things, some ideas I like in there, and I will cooperate with them when I think that there's something important at stake. And I think most people in the middle are not particularly well informed or have much to useful to say about politics. I think that both sides, both of our political parties are pretty crappy. And we don't have any viable third party that I could identify with myself. So I don't fit into a spectrum. Kenneth Hester's difference between anger and rage depends on what you want to call them. I mean, they're different terms, right? I mean, maybe rage is more anger. It all depends on which theorist you're looking at. All right, let me skip down a bit. Oh yeah, Auntie writes, anger truly is sweeter than honey. That's coming from Homer, and then Aristotle quotes that. I think you can control it and use it, but sooner or later it makes you overshoot. Yeah, exactly right. There is a pleasure involved in anger, and Aristotle gets at this. And after a while, this is part of what can make anger addictive as a response for us. So, all right. Trombone asked, what book do they talk about? A viewer said, why go to philosophical therapy when you can read the philo something? I think you can probably look through these comments, right? Most people. The philokalia, it's a set of books that compile writings by Eastern Orthodox writers. Very interesting stuff, very often philosophically informed, using a sort of mostly Neoplatonic anthropology, in which there's like the three parts of the soul. One of the best translations I've seen actually is in the English version of the philokalia, of that thumatic third part of the soul as the incandescent part of the soul. All right, let's see what else we got here. I'm gonna take another couple minutes. Robert writes, anger feels like it gives energy and strength to our self-defense and war against evil. Yeah, it's true. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's not. Sometimes we engage in self-defense against not evil, but actually good, like when somebody is giving us feedback that we don't like, and we think that they're trying to bust our chops, and then we fight against them. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that we can say. Jesus writes, have you ever covered the Marquis de Sade in any of your videos? Only in the porn stuff. No, I'm just joking. I don't do any porn stuff, right? No, I haven't done anything on de Sade. I probably should. I will probably end up talking about him first down the line if I ever do shoot some stuff on Lacan Seminar 7 on the ethics of psychoanalysis, because he brings him up, right? So that's good. Actually, I did mention de Sade in one video where I was talking about de Beauvoir's piece on Must We Burn de Sade. Retro Gamer, will Aristotle give paradigms of other emotions, or do we need to look to other thinkers for other emotions and their consequences? Rhetoric, book 2. He doesn't cover all the emotions, but he goes into them in great depth, so much so that Heidegger would later call that one of the first hermeneutics of emotions. So yeah, you want to look in Rhetoric, book 2. Andre Kolak, can you say one practical way to influence my wife's anger? I'm a very calm person and she's not. Socrates allegedly had an angry wife. I'd like to ask him how he dealt with his wife. Well, he didn't deal with his wife very well, right? He seemed to just put up with it. But he probably also pissed her off a lot, because, I mean, think about it. This guy, he doesn't pay any attention to his kids. He doesn't pay any attention to his household affairs. He goes around to dinner parties and hanging out with everybody, chatting. I mean, I wouldn't like to be married to Socrates. There's nothing I can say on here about, because I don't know you and I don't know your wife, about how to influence your wife's anger. So unfortunately, no. William Nelson, what languages do you know? Do you have any tips for language learning? I did a video about that. That's easily to Google, right? More Peterson stuff. People are really going on about that. And the alt-right. Mr. Whiffles, suicide attempts. Why don't you want to talk about Jordan Peterson? I have at great length already in many of these other times. So you can just go back and, watch through them and you'll hear that sort of stuff. So Darth Numerous, what do you think about Kant? Kant is, somebody like Hobbes or like many other thinkers who I don't agree with, but I find very, very interesting. I teach routinely. I think he's worth studying. I do really enjoy going through his works. I like seeing sort of the big picture and occasionally being surprised as I reread his stuff. So I'm going to be doing some more videos about Kant, by the way. More than just the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. I'm going to do some other Kantian texts. I'll probably do the Prolegomena because I know people can use help on that. Probably do, some of his essays like What is Enlightenment and Perpetual Peace. And then I'll see what else I want to dive into. Big Pit Guns. What sources do you use to study philosophy? For me, it's all primary sources. The one exception is when I'm doing like academic writing, or here's a great example. One of my clients sent me this recently. Brad Inwood's Ethics and Human Action in Early Stoicism. So this is a secondary text, right? Brad Inwood is a researcher on Stoicism. So I'll read that. I'll see what he has to say. But I'm always going to be going back to the primary texts. So let's see what else we got here. Mr. Whiffles, anger isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people have the mindset of seeing that as negativity and avoid people like that. Do you think using anger, hate is a bad way to be motivated? I think that if it's the main tool in your toolbox, you're going to break a lot of stuff. And if people are avoiding somebody because they think they're too angry, that's probably a sign that they are too angry. That said, it often does get used in kind of a rhetorical way. Oh, you're so angry, I'm not going to deal with you. I get this on YouTube comments where people write dumb stuff, and I'll be like, wow, you're really off base on that. And they'll be like, don't get so angry with me. And I'll think to myself, wow, what a dummy. I'm not angry with him. How the hell would he know or she know whether I'm angry with them? From a few lines that have no tone or context to them whatsoever. So there is kind of a trope, oh, you're angry, so I'm not going to deal with you. So you're right about that. But, even if you think anger is a good thing and you're a philosopher, like say Aristotle, you don't think it's uniformly a good thing. And you say most people are actually badly off with respect to it. All Vikings, is there any real substance to virtues? In a consequentialist way, something's considered to be in excess of the Nicomachean ethics could be beneficial, efficient, a CEO who wills himself to power. Yeah, you want to think that way about it, go ahead. The only way that you find out whether to answer your question, is there real substance of virtues? Yes. There's so much substance there that you can't really see the substance unless you actually start practicing some of this stuff that will open that up for you. A good person to read about that is Alistair MacIntyre, contemporary author. He discusses how we can, sort of be blind to that. But if you want to look at everything in a consequentialist way, go right ahead. Even the great consequentialists thought you still have to talk about virtue. Bentham does, Mill does. They have to have some way to work that in. So, Tian Pon, does the rage of Achilles come up in any philosophy? Yeah, it comes up in Plato and Aristotle and then in the Stoics, and they reference the rage of Achilles, right? All right. Let's see what we got here. What do I think about Fulton Sheen? I don't pay any attention to him. I read some of his stuff early on. It was kind of folksy and all that. Not somebody I have the time to spend time on. I'm sure he's a good guy, but who are we referencing here? Bishop Fulton Sheen, popular Catholic author from earlier in the last century. Oh boy, I'm going to try to close this out because I got to get some videos edited, and then I've got another meeting in less than an hour. Western philosophy, this is from Trombone 7. 10,000-foot view, all roads lead through Nietzsche to Heidegger. Thoughts? Nope. Western philosophy is a whole bunch of roads. You don't even have to go through Kant. you know, you can get some of what's going on in Kant in other thinkers too, like, you know, say for example, Marquis de Sade, right? And you know, people love to tell these narratives, these stories that are like a coherent story. Almost any simplistic story about philosophy is going to be false. So a lot more complicated than that. George Alexander Azaru, what do you think about feminism? I'm angered about that. Well, that's unfortunate. There's a lot of different kinds of feminism. So it's probably important to distinguish between them. You know, one way to do it is to think about equality versus like gender feminism. So where would somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft fit in? If you actually read her, you'll find that she's an equality feminist, and she would actually be a great ally of men against some of the excesses of feminism being put out there today. But, you know, it's interesting when I post videos about Wollstonecraft, I get hit from both women who are like, who are you to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft? You know, and I'll be like, well, you guys aren't talking about her. And then I'll have anti-feminists who are like, you know, typical feminist crap. And I'm like, well, clearly you haven't read Wollstonecraft, you know? So thanks for the thanks for the chiming in. So is feminism something to be angered about? I mean, first you have to actually say what kind of feminism or what aspects of it you're angered about. And then you can go from there. There could be some genuine injustices that you should be angry about. Probably not going to be a helpful strategy to be angry about it. All right. Robert, I think the question of good and evil is more important than calm or anger. Why pick? Why can't you just study both of them? They're both important. All right, let's see what else we got here. I hear the dog getting all whiny. I'm gonna have to take them out very soon too. Robert, as long as a good person doesn't use anger to do something evil, that's the critical factor. That's a nice criterion, I'd say. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to take a last question because it's already 1:22 here from the good man, so I'm not going to get to everybody. And I will answer, before I do that, Davis Duck, why you skip me? Because as everybody knows, I start out with the early questions, and then as time goes on and I get more and more questions, then I have to get more selective. So, you know, that's life. All right. The good man. Any good philosophy topics to talk about in bars? Well, now that depends. You got to have somebody who actually wants to talk philosophy. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we talk about in terms of philosophy as a way of life, that's stuff you could talk about in a bar. But you've got to, you know, have somebody who actually wants to hear it. I think, you know, talking to anybody in a bar about stuff that they're not really interested in is not, you know, enjoyable or good manners. So, but if you have an interlocutor, I mean, I've talked with a lot of people about philosophy in bars, and if you're lucky enough to find an interlocutor, oh, here she is, but lucky enough to find an interlocutor who really wants to talk philosophy, then pretty much anything you want to, you know, that you're competent to talk about. The one thing you shouldn't do is just bullshit around and call it philosophy, because then that gives philosophy kind of a bad name. So, all right. So this is the sign that it is time for me to get on with the rest of the day. This is Amika, and she, I think, wants to go outside. Is that what you want? You want to go outside? So, all right, I'm signing off. Thanks for all the questions and comments, and you know, try to get to as many as I can. We're already like 25 minutes over, so we'll have another one of these later this month. I also have an AMA session coming up next Saturday, I think it is, but you can check on, you know, Reason.io or on my Facebook page. I've got that stuff posted there. Now I got to go take care of this dog. All right, see you later.